I hope your eyes haven't started glazing over with all the graphs and charts that are being thrown at you. But I'll. Oh, good. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'll try and go through these quickly. We looked, I'm going to just look at the data and reporting we got on professional development and compensation. We know that very many people, the majority of respondents.
Sorry.
Okay.
She said she wasn't a good driver.
Yeah, I know. I'm not a good driver. You help me to do it?
Next slide.
There you go. That one?
Yes, please. Thank you. The majority of respondents reported that their companies made training available to them, and where people were eligible, the majority of respondents again took part in any training that was offered. Interestingly, people from North America reported in the lowest amounts that their companies offered training, and again in the lowest amounts that they were likely to participate. I'm not sure why that is, but that was what the data reported. If you look at what's on offer, very many people have taken skills training and professional development and management and leadership. Diversity and inclusion falls really quite low on the scale. And the data reports, I can't show that here, but what we've seen is that seems to increase with increasing age. So people in the younger age group are least likely to have done diversity and inclusion training, whereas those in the higher age groups have. Now, if we try to assess the effect of this training by different demographic groups. And what we find, next slide, when we ask the question, to what degree do you think this participation advanced or benefited your career, women were significantly more likely to report a minimal benefit compared with men. And I think that kind of ties into what we've been seeing across the board with the survey questions. Similarly, if you look at, next slide, if you look at the age group, this is very interesting because the older you are, it seems, the less likely you are to believe that training actually is of benefit to your career. So I think my favorite is the 66 plus, where there's a huge proportion that just says none. Yeah, it's enough. I think that is logical to a certain extent. At entry-level positions, there is more training available. You don't know that much, and you learn, and you go on very many courses. As you advance through your career, you tend to find that the courses available to you are either those that your company requires you to take by law, or things that really don't necessarily help advance your career. So these, when we come to talk about next steps, these are things we have to look at as an industry to see how we engage more and get people to be more interested or get to useful levels of training. Next slide, please. Right. Respondents who identify as Asian report in much higher proportions that training has been beneficial to career growth. Again, we know that this group is based in Asia, predominantly based in Asia, and also at the younger level. So that ties and that makes sense there. Respondents who identify as Black report in significantly higher numbers that training has had minimal benefit. This is significant and is of interest because respondents who identify as Black actually live in North America and Europe in high proportions, yet this group still seems, reporting as quite disengaged or not benefiting much from what's happening in the industry. There really were no significant differences regionally in terms of how people perceive the benefits to their career. You might notice there's some regions, say if you look at Western Africa or Western Asia, where people say none. But we can't report this as statistically significant just because the numbers are quite low. But it is just interesting to see the full picture. I'll quickly look at compensation. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, there are comments. Yeah, a few comments here just to give you a flavor of how people perceive training. Most people like the idea of training, but it's just unfortunate that workloads make it difficult for them to participate sometimes. And again, as we were saying earlier, people don't feel that the right sort of training is offered to them, so they don't necessarily want to take part. Okay, looking at compensation. Nearly 70% of respondents come in at the lower two levels of salary. And this doesn't surprise any of us, but I think it is a problem in the industry. It's perceived as a low salary, low income level industry, and this clearly shows that when you have pretty much more than 2/3 of the industry, pretty much 3/4 nearly, earning salaries in the lower brackets. It speaks to why there are problems with retention and getting people to stay, getting good people to stay. Next slide. Following on from Matt's observations earlier, this confirms the gender pay gap that's been so widely spoken about. So more women than men report earning in the lower regions, particularly in the $50K to $100K range. And as the earning levels increase, the proportions of men reporting in those bands are higher. And that's for every pay level above $100,000. So that's a pretty consistent story. And similarly, next slide, if you look at age, the bulk of the lower salaries are in the youngest pay group. And again, as age increases, the proportions of people in the higher levels increase. So you look at the yellow band there and the blue bands just show that the older you get. So there is some hope, I guess, if you want to stay in publishing for a long time. If you look at, next slide, by ethnicity, this paints a rather worrying picture. So Asian, people who identify as Asian are predominantly in the lowest level, and we think that's because from this survey, people identifying as Asian most of those respondents live in Asia, where we know that that's a regional difference. The people identifying as black, however, majority of them come within the lowest two bands, and people identifying as black live in high-paying regions. So that's something that points to, we've now started talking about a gender pay gap, but maybe it's also time to start talking about an ethnicity pay gap too, to see whether that takes us anywhere and advances the conversation in some way. And finally, with regions, as we were saying before, with ethnicities, the lowest salary levels are reported in the highest amounts in Asia as a whole, and in Northern Europe, reporting about 44%, compared with Western Europe, where that band is only about 28%, and North America, where it's only about 23%. And similarly, the highest salary bands are reported in more significant proportions in North America, compared with Northern Europe and Western Europe, where it's much, much lower. I'll leave you with a few comments. Next slide, from people who point to the recurring themes around salary and how it accounts for high turnover. The lack of transparency is pointed out, and people want to see more clearer and transparent reporting on earnings. Okay, so I'll hand you over to Susan, who will just try and summarize the key findings.
Do you want to pass the recorder and the, are you going to drive? Drive? Yeah, that would be great. Okay. So I'm going to do some key takeaways. Microphone. Oh. There you go. I'm going to do some key takeaways. There are many more insights, but these are things that struck us. First of all, there's a lot of good news from our survey. We found that the large majority of respondents find balance in their lives, report supportive cultures, good policies and benefits, and feel satisfied with many aspects of the work life. They value mentoring, and we see opportunities to improve it through their feedback. We network and grow through conferences and social media and committee work. Many colleagues in our industry feel empowered and engaged. Susan, you can go to the next one. Those are just those points. Next slide. But there are many obvious challenges and opportunities. Our data and comments support, as we've said, that fewer men than women see the bias facing women. One striking data point is that 55% of men agree that people of all genders have opportunity for advancement, while only 37% of women agree with that statement. The other way of looking at that is that 47% of women disagree that people of all genders have equal opportunity, while 26% of men do. So there's almost a 20% spread there. We believe the underrepresentation of men mentioned earlier is partly due to this phenomenon. The same is evident for white people and the barriers excluding people of color not seeing those barriers. Significantly, there's a higher percentage of all groups who acknowledge an age bias and a lower percent across the board that perceive bias on the basis of sexuality and religion. Next slide. But age bias is the elephant in the room. 52% of all respondents disagree with the statement that people of all ages have equal opportunities. Some companies, and there's a representative here from one of those leading companies, are leading the way with programs and a commitment to bring experienced older colleagues back into the workforce, and I think our industry would benefit. Next slide. Who your manager is makes a big difference in your experience, and that comes through loud and clear in our comments. Our takeaway is that equity and inclusion can't only come from the top. People at all levels of organizations need to be engaged in driving change so that it is spread throughout the organizations. Next slide. Many companies in our industry have their hearts in the right place, but they don't invest what they need to in the execution. Overcoming deeply embedded biases isn't easy and can't be achieved without a concerted and persistent effort, and I think that effort has begun. Next slide. After a decade or two of disruption, restructuring, consolidation, the companies we work in are very lean and mean, and people are faced with heavy workloads that interfere with driving change. Some people think, how can we focus on nice-to-have issues like diversity and inclusion? But my point, and I think a lot of people here agree, is how can we not, since study after study shows that innovation is boosted by diversity and our future really depends on it. Next slide. Experience varies by country and region. About 3/4 of our respondents live in the U.S., but we had significant participation from from participants in every region except for Antarctica. Our findings document the significant variation in policies, practices, and mores in, for example, Western Europe versus India versus the U.S. Hopefully, in the next few years, we'll move in the right direction. That's a big hope. Next slide. The WE survey was long and complicated, but actually it just scratched the surface of the issues. There is so much more to focus on in this endeavor going forward. Simone?